Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today for my first time in Kiev, and I'm really overwhelmed by the city and the people here. And yeah, I'm happy to share some insights I got about crypto economics. I'm not sure how deep you're already in the tech, so I hope it's not too technical, but we'll see. Otherwise, you can come to me after the talk and have a private discussion. I'm here the whole day. So I'm going to start with a period beginning last year where we had a tremendous rise of the Ether price, and we were in the middle of a project based on Ethereum. And yeah, when we saw this price rise, well, we had to pose the question, okay, how about transaction fees? If the price is sixfold now, what does it mean for our project? And this is what we thought would happen. Our assumption was that the transaction fees are somehow tied to some fiat currency, yeah? Be it US dollar or Chinese yuan or whatever, because the miners have to pay for electricity in local currency and whatever. So our expectation then was that in Ethereum we have the mechanism of gas price, and if Ether rises and gas is paid in Ether, then the gas price should drop to compensate for the rising Ether. But this is actually what happened. Nothing. Yeah, you see on the right side, beginning January last year, it's always been about 22 gigaway, and it didn't change at all. And so we started wondering, why is that? Why does Ether price does not react at all, or gas price does not react at all to the rising Ether price? And yeah, I want to dive into this. It's quite interesting, but first of all, a little bit of the foundations of money creation, and we'll look not only at Ethereum, but also at Bitcoin, because some calculations are more obvious for the Bitcoin part. So from now on, we'll have a look at both of them. I think most of you know how the money creation works on the public blockchains. There's transaction fee that goes to the miners, but there's also creation of new coins with every new block. And with Bitcoin, this is logarithmic creation. So we have kind of constant reward with every block, but this constant reward is cut by half every 4 years, roughly. So this leads to a total maximum of 21 million Bitcoin that will ever exist, no single unit more. And the important part here is the halving every 4 years, which we don't have with Ethereum. There we have linear creation, which is, at the moment, it's 3 Ether per block. They changed it recently with a hard fork, but it's not built in the protocol. So if the protocol is not changed, then this is static. We have 3 Ether per block, and the block time is 50 seconds, so we have 3 new Ether roughly every 15 seconds. And in addition to that, we have 2.6 roughly per uncle, which happens, on average every 300 seconds, which is at the moment approximately 6.5 million Ether per year. The important part here is there is no upper bound for Ether. Many people don't know it or just tend to ignore it, which is really a difference to the Bitcoin money supply. So in relation to the existing Ether, the new generation gets lower and lower, but still there's no upper bound. There will ever be more and more Ether. And maybe I don't have so much time in this talk. Usually I put it to 30 minutes or even 40, so I assume you roughly know what uncles are in Ether, and otherwise just come to me after if you don't get the whole calculation. I hope you will get it anyway. And I think most of you also know roughly how transaction fees work in the public blockchains. It's as it is decentralized, there's no central authority that can say these are the fees or that are the fees. There's just competition. Users, the client side, they just choose a transaction fee they consider appropriate, and they fight for a place in the next block. So it's like auctioning my transaction. And if I pay more, I have a higher chance of getting into the next block. And this is what leads us to the miner side of transaction fees. Yeah? Miners can, if they are lucky and find the next block, they can choose whatever transaction to include what they like. And usually miners like transactions that yield more fees per space they consume in the block. Yeah, and the important question here now is the third bullet you see here. If there's still space in the block, so the block is not full, and there are unconfirmed transactions, and those transactions have a non-zero fee, is there any reason you might think of why not to include this transaction if there's enough room? And the astonishing result is, the astonishing result is yes. There is a reason why not to include this transaction if the fee is too low. And this is because every additional transaction poses a cost for the miner. And I'm not talking about a little bit of processing time. Yeah, it's really peanuts. There's another cost, and this is about the crypto economics I want to calculate now with you together. And this goes like this. Every transaction included in a block increases the block size, yeah, and this in turn means it increases the time of propagation for the block. So the time the block needs to be known by the other peers in the network. And this poses an additional risk of someone else finding an alternative block. Yeah? And this is one bullet I missed in the slide before. I realized too late, maybe not all of you know how this works, but the reward for the miner is only given if you make it into the longest chain. Yeah? And it happens every now and then that two blocks come up more or less at the same time, and then it's a little bit of luck which block makes it into the longest chain. And so if your block takes longer to get to pass around in the network, then this is the risk increases that there's another block that may win. And so what you end up with is a probabilistic cost of losing your block reward. And looking at this is already interesting, but it becomes even more interesting if we start to quantify this cost. And it's with some simplified approaches, it's possible to do it here. And there are more sophisticated ways, and I'm almost sure every serious miner does these calculations much more accurately than we're going to do it today. But the principle behind is important to see here. So what are the parameters we need to quantify this cost? Well, first of all, we need the measurement of how much additional time the block takes per transaction we include. And second thing is, what's the average interval of the next block? So how much time do I usually have until the next block is found? And third one is, what's the value at risk? So what do I lose if I lose the block? And those three parameters lead to a quite interesting calculation. I'm starting with Bitcoin because the calculation is a little bit easier for Bitcoin. The value at risk, many of you know, at the moment is 12.5 Bitcoin. So with every block, you get transaction fees. I don't have them here, but also, even if you mine an empty block, you get 12.5 Bitcoins because they are newly created. And I have an analysis of how much propagation time we have. It's roughly 8 milliseconds per kilobyte. Figures are not quite recent, so it probably is a little bit smaller now, but it's not important for the principles behind. And the average transaction size is not even a kilobyte, it's more 250 bytes, so we end up with roughly 2 milliseconds per additional transaction. And you know, 2 milliseconds for us, it's almost nothing, but for IT systems, it's a measurable duration, and it really has an impact. And now, this is where I do a real simplification here. The calculation I have, let's say we have 12.5 Bitcoin at risk with a block, and we have 600 seconds on average before the next block is found. So this is roughly 0.02 Bitcoin per additional second that is the cost for bigger blocks. Yeah, if our for longer propagation time. So if my block takes 1 second longer to propagate, this puts 0.02 Bitcoin at risk. And now we can multiply this with the 2 milliseconds per additional transaction we have, and we end up with roughly 4,000 Satoshi per additional transaction, which is at the current market price, it's already 36 cents. And yeah, remember what this means. Below this price, it's better or rational for a miner to not include your transaction, even if the block still has room for it. Quite important. Now, similar but still slightly different calculation for Ethereum. Our value at risk here is 3 Ether per block, but we have this smart mechanism of rewarding uncles. So even if you don't make it into the longest chain, you get rewarded by roughly 2.6 Ether. And I leave it up to you to do the same calculations if we wouldn't have this mechanism of uncle rewards. You end up with quite shocking numbers of how much the minimum fee would be to include it in a block. Then with Ethereum, it's a little bit more difficult to calculate because the transaction size is not the only measurement we have, because we are Turing complete smart contract language. There is this notion of gas. The limit of the block is not in bytes but in gas. So we calculate more with gas here, although it's not quite accurate. The average transaction size on Ether is 40,000 gas. And now I'm referring to an analysis the Ethereum guys did themselves. Vitalik did a blog post on this, and they did a regression analysis on the past transactions and found out that per million additional gas in the block, this increased the chance of becoming an uncle by 1.86%. Which again sounds not much, but if you do the calculations, this means you put your value at risk is 0.3 Ether, and multiplied with this 1.86% leads to, you see the numbers, 6,975, whatever is, I think, Sabo, the next unit. So this is per million gas. So if you then take the 40,000 gas per transaction, you also end up with an additional cost per transaction. And yeah, with Ethereum at the moment, this leads to roughly 19 cents. Again, a lower threshold. Below, it doesn't make sense for a rational miner to include your transaction. And this is the calculation as we have it since October last year, because there was the Byzantinium hard fork. And now I did the same calculations because when we were in our project, the calculation was like this. So there were 5 Ether per block, and Anchor reward was only 3.2 Ether. And now same calculation leads to 90 cents per transaction, and below this, a miner would not include your transaction. And we actually saw a period where especially F2Pool mined a lot of empty blocks because, yeah, transactions were just below this threshold, so they would lose money if they include your transaction. And the precise figures, of course, they change with the Ether price and all this, but the important thing to keep in mind and to take away from this talk is we have a cost per additional transaction, and this cost is denominated in the native currency, not in any fiat currency you might think of, and this is really important and the insight from this talk. And yeah, I want to come back to the comparison now between Bitcoin and Ethereum, because again we see a huge difference in the conceptual setup. Now, if you compare the block reward, which is the new coins per block, with the average transaction fee that a miner can gain at the moment, this is, yeah, most of the reward is from the newly created coins, not from transaction fees. And with Bitcoin, it's currently 12.5 Bitcoin and roughly a half Bitcoin of transaction fees. And with Ethereum, it's 3 Ether and only 0.05 Ether for transaction fees. So as a miner, I have the choice of either I mine a completely empty block and get 3 Ether, or I include a packed block with many transactions, slow down my block, and only get 3.05 Ether. Yeah, and you can calculate the ratio between the two. It's 25 for Bitcoin at the moment, and it's 60 for Ethereum at the moment. This is already a difference, but I think the more crucial part here is we have the Bitcoin halving. So let's think 20 years in the future, the creation of new coins with Bitcoin will be below 1 Bitcoin. Yeah, but still assuming the price doesn't change in 20 years, which, yeah, obviously Bitcoin will rise in 20 years, we all know this, but assuming this won't change, we have half of the reward is a block reward and half is transaction fees. We don't have the halving for Ethereum, so this ratio won't change at all if Ether price doesn't change. And already with the last hard fork, we see Ethereum had good reasons to cut down from 5 Ether to 3, and I'm expecting they do this reduction again in future hard forks. The only thing is we don't know when they're gonna do it, and it's not baked into the protocol. So now we have a better understanding of this non-moving of the Ether gas price. It's just because we have a lower bound where it just doesn't make sense for a miner to include your transaction. And this effect is all the stronger if you don't have full blocks. Yeah, if you're in a situation like Bitcoin has been for long, where the blocks are full anyway, then you have competition in fees for the blocks, which is above this lower threshold. But if the blocks are not full, then this is the lower bound. Yeah, transaction fees won't fall below this threshold. And yeah, this is what we saw last year. Yeah, and as a final slide, I have this. As conclusion, crypto economics are much more complex than you might think at first sight. It's really interesting to see those mechanisms in actions. It's a lot about game theory and really crypto incentives. It's really fun to be part of this, but it's also, you have to know what you're doing. And as a side note, on other public chains, you see that claim they don't have transaction fees or are much cheaper. It's very often the case that, they don't have transaction fees because they are not used. So blocks are small and there's no fee or no cost to include those transactions. And even if they don't show the same effects, be sure in every public chain there is kind of crypto economics that play out in unforeseeable way, and we really need to get this experience and just better understand how those systems behave. But it's worth it. All of you, I think you are here because you know this, but we have to dive into it. And now you see the small box. The green box was the period of our project, and you see what Ether price did afterwards, and this is even outdated. So luckily we weren't on the main chain with our project. It was on the Robson testnet, so we were lucky, but the transaction fees we anticipated for our project were far too high in the end of the project. Okay, so thanks. I hope you got some of the calculations I did, and I'm ready for questions.